Hello, puppies and kittens. I often make videos where I'm responding to the particular challenges that were made to me personally. And recently, somebody sent me a link to what they thought was evidence of telepathy. And unfortunately, the first version of that was not in the form of a peer-reviewed scientific study. The first version of that was in the form of this guy's video that was like, I don't know, 3.5 to 4 hours long. And I'm like, who still lives in a world where we have that kind of time? And then when I start watching it, I'm immediately impressed with that the guy that's talking, I don't think is sane. And he's completely rambling, and he thinks that if there was telepathy, that would somehow prove Christianity, and specifically biblical literalism. An interesting thing about that was, I used to believe in telepathy. I believed in telepathy as an atheist. I believed in telepathy as a neo-pagan spiritualist. I believed in telepathy the same way that Gene Roddenberry, who was also an atheist, also believed in telepathy. A lot of people did. A lot of the people behind Star Wars, Star Trek, both of them, they thought that there were powers of the mind, and they didn't necessarily believe. They didn't even think they believed in supernatural things. That they thought that this was somehow natural. So if there was such a thing as telepathy, that'd be awesome, wouldn't it? I would so want to know. It was so disappointing to me when I used to believe in all these things, all these psionic abilities that I honestly thought people had, and that this would enable me to be a Jedi. Because if I hadn't seen Star Wars before reading the Tao Te Ching, then I would have been a Taoist. But I heard Obi-Wan Kenobi expounding on what the Force is, and of course that swayed me more. But so this guy comes up with a study that he says promotes telepathy, and that's going to disprove all my criticisms against the Bible somehow. And he also thought that I was running from him, because they all do. What? You've got a scientific study you think says a thing. If it actually said that thing, I'd be like, wow, dude, that is awesome. That's amazing. Why would I run from that? I don't have a belief system, and this is the problem. You have people with a belief system who cannot comprehend of people not having a belief system. I was very disappointed to walk away from, to have to abandon all of my supernatural beliefs, all my paranormal beliefs, all of that. I used to think ectoplasm was a real thing that somebody had in storage in a museum somewhere. A lot of us did back at that time. And it was a little disappointing and certainly embarrassing to realize had we been duped by all of this stuff. So if some of that could be justified after all these years, I'd be delighted. I'm not running from you. And it's not that I don't want to believe. It's not that I want to believe this thing and don't want to believe this in your truth. I don't want to be fooled into believing anything that is not evidently true. So I get this study and I look it over, and right away I realize I'm not the guy that should be reading this. So I tend to want to check with experts, especially when something seems dubious. So I reached out to Dr. Chris Thompson, neuroscientist at Virginia Tech. Is it Virginia Tech?
That's correct. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for having me back. We discussed once upon a time the neuroscience of the soul.
Yes.
And that was a good conversation. I wish I could record all of them that I've had. I've talked to a half a dozen neuroscientists. They all have the same opinions.
Yes.
Unfortunately, a lot of professional scientists are not good at communicating these ideas on camera, and are maybe not interested.
Sure.
In communicating these.
I think that's so fair. Yeah.
There's value in anybody that will take that intrepid step into the fodder of the YouTube comments to try to do science communication, which is easily as important as science itself, when most of the world doesn't understand anything anymore. So, Dr. Thompson.
Yes.
Enough of my rambling. Would you please explain to me this paper?
Sure. So thanks for having me on again. I really appreciate it. As far as science communication goes, I agree. It can be a huge hurdle to try to explain complex topics like how the brain works. Um, Evolution, as you know, can be challenging to explain to a lay audience. And good science communicators will do their best to try to break it down so that as many people can understand it as possible. I've tried to make it a big part of the way I do my science to try to make it as communicable to as wide an audience as possible. So I'm here to help you with this paper. This is a review article. It is not great, I will say right up front. It's got a number of flaws, quite a few flaws, and certainly lapse in logic. So it's not a study, first of all. It is basically a review article. So in science terms, we have our peer-reviewed research that will be original data that will be evaluated by 2 or 3 anonymous peers. They will look at the quality of the data, how the paper is written. You'll often get comments back. That doesn't mean that every peer-reviewed article is of good quality. There can be junk that gets through the peer review process, for sure. Sometimes authors, what they do is that they will submit research to a journal. It will get rejected from that journal. They'll do it again to a different journal, and they'll do this over and over and over again until they find some, tiny little journal that'll sneak through, where there just isn't kind of the scrutiny that would be placed at, say, more high tier journals. That is something that happens. I'm sure you're well aware of that. And that's how, like, even some, garbage young earth creationist stuff gets through, right? We know of examples like that. It's not a perfect process, but it works pretty well. It's a way of making sure that we have rigorous, good science get communicated. Now, this is a review article. It is not original peer-reviewed research. This may have been peer-reviewed. So oftentimes when you write a review article, it will be looked at by an editor. It might be seen by 1 reviewer or 2 reviewers. I've never heard of this journal. I think that it's not like an unknown journal, but it's a relatively low-tier journal, from what I understand. Okay, so all that set aside, this paper's got a number of flaws. So this paper is communicating that direct brain-to-brain communication is possible through a mechanism of electromagnetic fields, essentially. Okay, let's break that down a little bit. First of all, right now, you and me, Arn, we're having direct brain-to-brain communication, right? Even though this is happening over the internet, my brain is coming up with words that are coming out of my mouth. It is passing through my microphone, being passed through the internet. It is coming out of your speakers, hitting your ears, and then acting on your brain circuits to activate your auditory centers. That is direct brain-to-brain communication to some degree. I mean, okay, it's at least brain-to-brain communication. What he's saying is direct brain-to-brain communication is that the activity that could be read somehow from my brain could potentially be read by another brain. Now, there's a lot of conflation that happens in this article. For instance, okay, well, first of all, what are your thoughts, Arn, about this? Like, give me your impression. I want to hear from you a little bit about what your impression is of this paper and where you think some of the flaws might be.
Well, what I'm getting is that there has been research showing for prosthetics, trying to show how you can get the brain to operate a mechanical limb, and there's been some progress in that area. So,
Yes.
And it's not just by using the existing muscles. They're trying to get, because sometimes they don't have the muscles to work with, but they still want to have the functionality. So there's a way to wire so that the cerebral synapses will still activate the mechanical arm. And one of the first arguments that I heard against that was from people that insist that thoughts are supernatural, and therefore cannot be made to operate mechanical devices, because it has to be somehow the soul that does all of this.
Right.
So
obviously that's not true. Like, we know that the brain is organized in a largely modular way. Like, there are certain parts of the brain that do certain things. For instance, there is a motor cortex that has a map of our entire musculature system. It is mirrored on the one side. So the left side of your brain that has the motor cortex controls the right side of your body, and then the right side controls the left side of your body. So when I'm moving my right hand right now, my left motor cortex, the part of my motor cortex that controls my hand, is activated. And if I had a series of electrodes that were placed on my head, you would see activity. That activity that is being detected is electrical in nature in some ways. It is. So basically what happens when neurons fire is that there's a current of ions that pass across the membrane of the neuron, of the membrane of the neuron, and that allows for action potentials. And if a group of neurons is activating in a coordinated way, you can detect that summation of all that activity on the outside of the head. Okay. That might make you think, well, wow, we could then maybe detect from a larger distance than just on the outside of our head. The issue with that is that, first of all, electromagnetic, so an EEG is basically what you do when you're measuring those things. So you have a series of electrodes that you would put on your head, and you would be measuring the activity that's just underneath that electrode. So I included in my presentation a picture of what an EEG scalp helmet looks like. This one has even fewer electrodes. There's some that have even more than that. And this would allow you to read the activity of what's happening across the brain at those specific places. That's because the brain is modular. So the EEGs that would be right above my motor cortex would be firing as I am moving my hand, right? So you would see an increase in activity there. So going into physics, right? If there is a current passing through an area, that also creates a magnetic change. So there's a magnetic field that can occur when that is happening. And that's not exactly what EEG is measuring. It's measuring a change in voltage that is detectable at the surface of the head. But there is some magnetism that could be detected as well, okay? What this guy is arguing is that magnetic field has the potential of being detected in other brains nearby and then read so that you could understand that person's thoughts. There's a lot of problems with this. Can you tell me what you think about this? Okay.
Well, one of the other arguments, and again, these are pseudoscience arguments, right, but that telepathy would have to operate like the concept of Tesla's transmission of energy. He built these Tesla towers, and he just thought, right, you could just like put it's much like a cell phone signal that would just cause things to operate because the signal exists nearby. Sure. And so people have this impression that there's a medium through which thoughts can transmit. That the obvious parallel is that it's like cell phone signals, that it's like radio waves.
Yes.
Right, that people can broadcast this. Mm-hmm. But if that were the case, then when we have prosthetic limbs, for example, we know that what synapses or how, yes, the mechanics are involved in operating that. And there is not, and you would know, mm-hmm, there is not a medium known to science by which thoughts can be transmitted or received, and sure, there's no device that can pick up such a thing. If there was a medium, mm-hmm, we should have, before we can say that there is such a medium, that would have something to detect these thoughts, something to detect the transmission from, not even just from one mind to another, but we could detect whether something's producing radio signals, whether there's an intended recipient for, yes, those signals or not. We're picking, right, up radio signals from Jupiter, for example. So we would have similar sorts of understanding for telepathy in humans.
Yeah. And so the going back to the prosthetic limb issue, so let's say someone lost their limb right about here. Okay. We do have prosthetics now. They're in development, and they've just been getting better and better, where you could put the prosthetic onto the stump right here, and you could have such fine control of the motors that would be built into the prosthetic so that it would function very similarly to how a regular hand would work. And that person would be controlling it, not necessarily from activity directly in the mind, but by a series of electrode sensors that would be built into the prosthetic itself at the stump. Because when you cut off the hand, there's a bunch of nerves that are severed at that point, but they don't disappear. Those nerves get pulled back and they will segregate in many ways. And so that the nerves that control like your index finger or your middle finger or your thumb, we could create electrode sensors that will be able to pick up that individual nerve activity that would then allow, so when the person is thinking like, okay, I need to move my hand, basically you have a series of sensors that would be reading the activity at the stump saying like, oh, this person wants to move their thumb. So then the thumb would start moving and you're using the same neurons that would have been used to basically use your thumb. Now, it's not always necessarily the same.
Sometimes you could have just said that you're using the existing wiring.
Yeah, you're using the existing wiring, and it could be rewired in a way that your brain then gets restructured. And that's where some interesting neuroplasticity occurs in the brain to say, oh, well, normally if I was thinking about moving my thumb, it's moving other parts of the prosthetic limb, but you can retrain your brain to say, oh, well, now that's the thing that moves my hand like this, my new prosthetic limb like this, instead of moving my thumb. So you retrain your brain to figure it out. Like then you can get coordinated control of the prosthetic limb. Does that make sense?
And a nice way to illustrate that, I think, is when the cat walks over your keyboard and now suddenly your screen has gone from landscape to portrait, and you
and you got to reorient things, right?
And where moving your mouse this way would usually go that way, but no, now you've got to you got to move it left to go up.
Right, and then you got to adjust. That's exactly right. And so when you add in a prosthetic limb, we may not necessarily know like precisely which nerve that's at the remnant at the stump is going to control which electrode. That's up to the patient to figure out a little bit over time with practice. But that patient will get so good that then they'll have very good control over that robotic prosthetic limb. But that's using electrodes that are right adjacent to the skin, because if it was any farther away, the signal is too weak to pick up. So even with very sensitive electrodes, this is the thing, like if we're picking up changes in voltage or say a change in electromagnetism, which is what this paper is arguing, it disperses the farther away you get away from that signal. And if you're already dealing with a really weak signal, that means one, you need strong detectors, and two, it needs to be close in order to really see it. And so I was doing some looking into this about like, what is the strength of the magnetic field at the surface of the scalp? So this is just right at the scalp. And it's around 1,000 femtotesla. So we measure magnetic field strength in Teslas. Okay. So femto is pretty small. This is very, very small. So do you have any idea? I'm curious to hear what you might think. How strong that is relative to the strength of the Earth's magnetic field? What would be the difference, do you think?
Well, I mean, the Earth's magnetic field actually exceeds the boundaries of the planet by quite a big ways.
True, but I'm talking about like at the surface. You know, it does have effects, of course, right? You can use a compass, for instance, right? And so there is a magnetic field that one can detect. How strong is that?
And then we also have I forget the term, but we have the protection from solar radiation. There was a time back in like 1990 or thereabouts where they wanted to terraform Mars, and a whole bunch of political leaders got together, and President Bush signed, and it was like this first global humanitarian effort to go terraform another planet, while the scientists are trying to get these political leaders to listen to them and say that there's no magnetosphere, so it doesn't matter what you do. You can't live there.
Exactly. Yes. Because you need that magnetosphere in order to protect you from the solar radiation. And we saw this pretty gloriously, even here in Virginia, when there was the solar flare that caused the
when everybody on the planet got to see
it was awesome.
Boreal.
It was
all
great.
Except for me and my wife.
Oh, really? What happened with you guys?
We arrived about 10 minutes late. We showed up to this little small town, and we're trying to find a good place to. We find a good place to watch for it, and somebody pulled up in a car and says, "You're waiting for the Aurora, didn't you?" We were just at this location. It was there for about 15 minutes and was gone. And we just came from that location, and we arrived 10 minutes late.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, it was pretty glorious here. It was very pink where we were at. We got there just in time to see it. We went up into the mountains, my son and I, and it was amazing. It was really cool. But the thing is, okay, so the Earth's magnetic field that we can feel, well, that one could potentially feel at the surface of the Earth is around 50 microtesla, which is 50,000 times stronger than the strongest amount of magnetic field that you're going to detect at the surface of the scalp. So already that's ubiquitous. That relatively low level of magnetic field is across the surface of the Earth. So that would be any signal that you could potentially detect, even at the surface of the scalp, would have to be done under conditions that are going to shield it from the Earth's magnetic field. And two, you have to understand that magnetic field gets weaker and weaker the farther away you get from the source. It's just like any kind of magnet. You take a magnet off of the refrigerator, you put it up against the metal, it'll stick. But if you pull it away and you hover it over something, and remember, a refrigerator magnet is pretty weak. It's not going to pick up stuff. You have to put it really pretty close to it. I was doing some calculations. A regular typical refrigerator magnet is pretty weak. It is the same amount of magnetic field that you can feel at the surface of the skin of the scalp at about 1 centimeter's distance. So it's not very strong at all. So this is actually a very weak field, and that's at the surface. So now you have to envision something that's just going to get weaker and weaker the farther a person is, or say an animal is, from another animal. That this is now there's going to be so much signal lost that there's just no way that it could possibly be detected. So this paper is mostly focused on the fact that we do know that there are animals that can use magnetoperception, like a sixth sense, basically. But what most of that research is focused on are animals that use certain kinds of magnetic sensing abilities in their brains to sense the Earth's magnetic field, so that they can do these long distance migrations. So
but what you're telling me, it would give the impression that perhaps Obi-Wan couldn't really communicate with Leia from a different star system away.
Not using electromagnetic fields, that's for sure. There would have to be some other mechanism. It's not whatever this paper is saying. This paper is trying to claim that because there are brains that have electromagnetic perception, that they can sense magnetic fields, that therefore, and we do know that brains can generate some magnetic field force, therefore brains can then sense the activity in other brains so that they could then read out those things. So there's a number of figures in this paper that are kind of silly, frankly. The first figure is, if we're going to look at that, might show here. The first figure is a figure that's showing that there are ionic changes that can occur across the membranes of bacteria. And we do know that some bacteria will orient themselves in a way because they are creating these very small local magnetic field. And so they will orient themselves in that way. What that has to do with brains, I really don't know, other than the fact that also neurons do have these ionic changes that occur across their membranes, and that therefore they generate magnetic fields. But neurons don't organize in any kind of way around electromagnetic fields. A given chunk of brain tissue is going to have axons going this way and that way and other ways. And therefore, the electromagnetic field within a given chunk of brain tissue is going to be very disordered. It's not like how you get an electromagnetic field that passes down a wire when you're passing a current down a wire. When you pass a current down a wire, you may remember this, there's it's the right-hand rule or the left-hand rule. Current goes this way, so the field goes this way. If you remember that from physics from ancient times. that's basically the principle that we're talking about here, that you're going to have, because there's an electrical current, there's a magnetic field that is generated from that. But the brain is not organized in such a way so that you're going to have perfectly coordinated electromagnetic fields. The other thing is that when you have thoughts, and when I am thoughts, or when you are perceiving something, if you're seeing something, or if you're hearing something, or if you're doing some sort of motor output, of course, there's activity in the brain that coordinates and regulates that process. That is a very specific thing that happens in particular parts of the brain. For instance, as I talked about, the motor cortex on my right side of my body is controlling my left hand. How would you be able to detect that there's activity happening right here in this little part if the rest of my brain is also doing a bunch of stuff? How would you be able to decipher that electromagnetic information once it hits your electromagnetic detectors?
Well, the way that you would do that is, I mean, you can have these devices that you put on somebody's head with all these sensors on, but you can also use tactile sensors that were already devised to be sensors that are already attuned to our brains. You just connect our brains to somebody else's brains.
That's right.
So what you do, and Spock does this all the time, and he puts the fingers on the person's head, right, in just the key places, and then they're interconnected. And now he's it's a hardwire. It's obviously not Wi-Fi, but now we've got a hardwire connection.
But a problem with the telepathy hypothesis is that there's distance between these two organisms, right? If you have a human being here and a human being standing 3 feet over there, if they're supposed to be reading my brain, how are they going to get the coordinated information of magnetic fields that are very, very localized? That I would argue, I agree, like if you could do it close like Spock, or you have a bunch of sensors across the scalp, you would be able to detect those changes in electromagnetism, sort of like how we do EEG. EEG is not the same as EMF, but you could do it similarly. What he's arguing, though, is that because there are these magneto sensors in the eyes of some animals, it's called cryptoform, or let me double check to see what it's called. Cryptochrome 2. It is a protein that somehow has magnetosense, and it's found in the retinas of some animals. I think it's found in the retinas of many animals, and therefore it allows these animals to see, quote unquote, the magnetic field of the Earth. And we know that there's this mechanism that allows them to then traverse long distances across the Earth, right? When they're traveling north and south, they're using these magnetic field lines. And so we're pretty sure that this is one mechanism by which this occurs. But remember, this is because they're detecting a mechanism that involves a magnetic field that is 50,000 times stronger than the amount that you can detect at the scalp of the head, right? It's just they're not going to be sensitive enough, nor will they be able to detect the coordinated activity. And so there's another slide.
Even if they were, even if they were, it's like you said, you can. Yeah. Let's say that you have some ability, whether it's in the eyes or it's the fingertips or whatever, that you could detect the electromagnetic field being generated by the mind, and probably, I would think, the chemical actions of the entire body are going to be generating some degree of this because we are essentially electrified. But you're only going to be able to pick up that electromagnetic field where it is.
Yes,
that's it.
Yes.
So you're not going to be able to get telepathic messages.
No, like if I were trying to detect the electromagnetic field right above my motor cortex, going back to the motor cortex again, but I was standing over here, how would I disambiguate the activity here or here or here or here? You wouldn't. Like all those areas are going to be generating their own electromagnetic fields. And by the time it gets 3 feet away, it's going to be incredibly weak that I don't even know how. Well, I was doing some looking, and there's a paper that said that they could detect some brain activity using EMF 63 centimeters away. So they had to use really powerful detectors to be able to do that. But 63 centimeters, I mean, that's just like almost 2 feet, right? with really powerful detectors that are intended and directed towards the head in order to detect these things. Not biological magnetodetectors, right? That are set up, that have evolved to detect magnetic fields that are 50,000 times stronger than what we're talking about, right? So it's ludicrous to think that, one, we would be able to even detect these things at any kind of distance, because there's a loss of the electromagnetic field the farther you get away from the source. And two, how would you even be able to disambiguate the activity in one part of the brain from the other part of the brain if you're using these magnetosensors, say in the eye, which there's a figure in this paper showing magnetic fields coming off of one brain being sensed by the eye, and that somehow that this would be then transposed into the visual cortex, which is how we know like the cryptochrome 2 pathway works. It eventually makes its way into the visual cortex, but how would this even be then perceived by this person? It's ludicrous that somehow the magnetic fields coming off of one brain would be somehow perceived in the eye as having some kind of valuable information to that person, that where you would be able to like see their thoughts. It just could not possibly work that way through the mechanisms that we know. And then there's just a bunch of errors in this paper. So this paper, in the conclusion, so the conclusion kind of lays out a bit of what this paper is talking about. So I can kind of read a little bit of what this conclusion says, kind of summarizing things. It may be hypothesized that large synchronized outbursts of cortex neurons in the frontal lobe, an area extensively involved in social cognition in a wide variety of mammalian species, from rodents to primates, produces electromagnetic fields around the brain. This field may be able to influence cortical neurons in the frontal lobe of another brain by inducing action potentials in large groups of neurons, which can transmit information such as different emotions and cognition cues to the other brain. So that's the summary of what this paper is trying to argue. And it just isn't true. We know for a fact that that's impossible. But the paper goes on. So then they, in their summary, then they cite two studies, which they're trying to claim is going to be along the lines of this. Okay. So they say a possible confirmation of this phenomenon is seen in two studies carried out, one in rats and one in Egyptian fruit bats. In both studies, action potentials were recorded in the frontal cortices of two rats or bats close to each other. Interestingly, after starting action potentials in animal 1 as the encoder, the same action potentials with the similar, and they misspell similar here, patterns immediately appeared in the frontal cortex of animal 2 as the decoder. Now that sounds like, oh, wow, super interesting how that phenomenon might work. This seems to kind of confirm his hypothesis that you could potentially have activity in one brain being read by another brain. Okay, and there's these two studies. Now, let's take the bat study first. Okay, so in this study, basically, so I took some figures from this paper, and I got some problems with this paper. It looks like it's been pretty heavily cited. It's been cited a few dozen times, and I don't think it's junk. I actually think that they did some interesting work. Basically, what they did is they took electrodes and they implanted them into the frontal cortex of various bats. And now these electrodes had a wireless antenna that was then sending the activity to a recorder someplace. So these bats are like free moving. They can do whatever they want. They can fly around, or they can kind of sit and perch. They were basically letting them do whatever they wanted. And then, so basically an electrode is it's a device that allows you to measure the activity of groups of neurons. Okay. So they have them implanted in the frontal cortex. And this, the paper that we're reading had talked about the frontal cortex being involved in social behavior. Of course, it's involved in more than that, but certainly it's involved in social behavior. So that makes sense. Basically, what these guys found is that there appeared to be coordinated activity within the frontal cortex of bats that are being simultaneously recorded if they were interacting with each other. But if you put them into, say, two separate chambers, there's no coordinated activity. Okay, so that's interesting. It seems like, oh, so there must be this special connection between these animals that maybe one brain is influencing the activity of the other brain. I think what's pretty clearly happening, though, is that if you look at the second figure on that first slide, basically they categorized what these animals are doing. That's what the two bars are on the top. So we have bat 1 and bat 2. And the different colors correspond to different activities. Now you can see that there's a lot of dark blue. Dark blue is when the animals are resting, okay? And then the other ones are various other kinds of behaviors, including like self-grooming, but also interactions, or being non-social, or like doing sort of social activity. Now, what they find is that, and so then the graphs below are two different kinds of readouts of this neural activity. And they measured them over a long period of time. They measured them about 100 minutes, which, you know, for doing this kind of work, that's impressive to have a long recording from free flying bats that are interacting and doing their own thing. So there's some neat stuff here. Basically, what they're seeing is that if the animals are interacting with each other, so the green line is bat 1 and the orange brown line is bat 2. And basically what you can see is that if the animals are interacting with each other, so like right in the middle of that figure, what you can see is that the activity seems to go up. So there's increased activity, and so therefore increased sort of firing happening in the frontal cortex when these animals are interacting with each other. And then when they are not interacting with each other, or especially if they're resting, you see that in both animals, there is decreased activity. So it makes sense that there would be coordinated activity. So basically, if the animal is just like not doing anything, there's not going to be a whole lot of activity in this frontal cortical area. But if they're interacting with each other, well, then there's going to be increased activity. And if you're talking about two animals that are either just sitting there resting, well, then both of their cortical areas should be decreased in activity, and that's what we see. And then if they're interacting with each other, well, then the social areas of the frontal cortex should be active. So they see a correlation. That's basically what this paper shows. There's a perfectly rational, reasonable explanation for why that would be. Areas involved in social interaction should be firing a fair amount when two animals are socializing. And then these areas,
that means that when the animals are looking at each other.
Yeah, it's looking, and they they include a lot of things. They include their wing covering, or there's mating, there's fighting, there's provoking. There's a bunch of different behaviors that they describe in here. There's a bunch of stuff. So they see increased activity in the frontal cortex when they're doing those things, and then decreased activity when they're not doing stuff together. Therefore, there's a correlation in activity. That's largely what I see in this paper. Now, these authors, they get into the nuance, and they think that it's a little bit more complicated than that. I don't actually see it as being more complicated than that. They do some important tests, though. So the next slide shows what do the bats look like when they're in separate cages, right? So here they're just basically, they're either active, but they're not being social because they're by themselves, or they're doing self-grooming, or they're resting. And mostly what you can see is that there's not coordinated activity between these two bats when they're in separate cages. That makes sense, even though I don't know if they're right next to each other or not. I didn't read the paper that closely, but you can definitely see that, like in bat 1, there is decreased activity when the bat, it really isn't doing much, and there's increased activity when they're doing stuff. But I think the most interesting figure is panel C and panel F. And that's where they have one bat, the green bat with a different animal that's not being recorded, and then the brown bat with another animal that's also not being recorded. So we're recording from two different bats, but they're interacting with different animals, not with each other. And here we see no correlation in activity, but again, we still see, overall decreased activity when the animals are not doing much, when they're resting, and increased activity when they're interacting with the other bats. So social brain areas they fire more when animals are doing social things. And if you have two animals that are interacting with each other, you're going to see an increase in these brain areas. And then if they're just sitting there resting, there's not going to be a whole lot of activity. That does not mean that these animals have some sort of telepathic connection, as this author is trying to claim. They think that it is, but it's clearly not. And
okay, you said that this paper was cited a bunch of times, and that it wasn't junk. But you're saying
the bat paper has been cited a bunch of times.
Okay,
this paper has been cited 4 times, as far as I can tell, and one of those times was also by the same author. And I read that paper as well, I did some work for you, Aaron. I hope you understand. I went to work for this. I read that paper too, and it is bad. It's really bad. It is on like EMF, and it's about how EMF affects the developing fetus. So they had rats that got pregnant rats that were bombarded with EMF, or they were under stress. And then they looked in the brain to see if there was increased basically cytotoxicity. They were looking for cell death. They were doing a number of measurements of like what the brain looks like. And I just don't trust their measurements. It really didn't look like what you would expect it to look like. There was way too high cell death in the animals that were exposed to either the EMF or the stress. And honestly, the cell death was too high in the animals that were that were exposed to no stress at all. So it did not look like what I would know that to look like. It just didn't make any sense. So, and that's the one paper, that one of the 4 papers that cites it. It's by the same author. Okay, so there's that. Now, the other thing I wanted to go back to was that he cited a rat study. Okay, so in that rat study, so this is after we go through the bat studies. Remember, he cited 2 studies. He said that there's these bats with coordinated activity, and then he also claimed that this rat study supports his hypothesis. In the case of the rat study, the decoder rat also performed the same action as the first encoder rat. The potential role of brain magnetic particles, or magnetites, which are thought to be these iron-based crystals that may be in some brain areas, and it's thought that's one hypothesis, that some animals might have a magnetoperception ability of detecting the Earth's magnetic field, is that they may have these iron particles in some neurons. May be effective in perceiving another brain's magnetic field. Okay, so he's citing this rat study as this. So we go to the next slide. This is how bad this study is, this paper. So at least the bat study had 2 bats that were not causally linked to each other, other than the fact that they're interacting with each other. Here, this is an interesting study. So this study has actually been cited a whole bunch of times. This study has been cited. This is the study. It's by Paez Vieira et al. It published in 2013. It's called A Brain-to-Brain Interface for Real-Time Sharing of Sensory Motor Information. And what I have on this very first figure is their first figure, is a summary of kind of the way they have this all set up. So let me walk through a little bit of what they did in this study. They had one rat, which is called the encoder, okay? This rat has an electrode placed in its M1, which is the primary motor cortex, okay, M1. Basically, this electrode, it's a multi-unit electrode, so it's recording the activity of a bunch of neurons, okay? And that's what the M1 neural ensemble is. So they're able to record the activity of these neurons. Now, they have this rat in a box that has a light on it that's going to be like a red circle that will light up, and then the rat has to pick like either the right lever or the left lever in order to, it's going to be, if the light is a red circle, I think they pick one lever, and if it's something else, they have to pick the left lever. Okay, so basically they have to choose between the levers, and that's what that little picture shows. Now, when the rat is doing this, there's going to be a certain kind of activity pattern when they're picking the left lever versus the right lever. So we know this, like the activity is just going to be slightly different, and that activity could potentially be read out to something else. For instance, maybe to another rat. So they have a rat in a different cage where they basically take that information from all those neurons. So that's being recorded in a computer. Then they do this sigmoid transformation where they're transforming that information into a readout that's now being stimulated inside the brain of a different rat. And that rat is called the decoder. So this is a direct brain-to-brain interface, but has nothing to do with magnetic perception whatsoever. They're literally have an electrode in one rat's brain. They're reading the activity. They're then transposing that activity into the brain of another rat. And now that rat has to choose the left lever or the right lever. Now, okay, interesting. It's an interesting experiment to see, can we take information from the brain of one rat, cause it to stimulate activity in the brain of another rat to allow them to learn like which lever they're supposed to press.
So what they're essentially doing is establishing an Ethernet connection with a cat.
That's exactly right. Yes. And so there's a video in the next figure that shows this. So this is from this paper. It's in the PowerPoint that I sent you. Feel free to show it. It shows essentially this. There's no magnetic perception here at all. The author of the paper that you sent me claims that this is evidence for the activity of the neuron from one brain being read by the brain of a different rat, like to prove this electromagnetic perception hypothesis. And that's not what's happening here. It's literally through wires of an Ethernet connection. And the thing that's kind of cool about this paper is that they also, because they have a lab at Duke University, and then they also have a separate lab in Brazil. So they did this experiment again, and then but they had an encoder rat in Duke, and their decoder rat was in Brazil. So they just did it over the internet instead of doing both rats in the same facility at Duke. So they did use the internet to do it, actually. So they were able to get a change in the activity. And so basically, the decoder rat was not as good as the encoder rat. So if it's chance, it's going to be a 50-50 chance of the decoder rat being able to interpret this information and getting it correct. So the encoder rat, which is the one that's like getting the light signal, was nearly 100% correct at the time. Most of the time they were close to 100% correct. The decoder rat was better than chance. It still wasn't as good as the encoder rat because it's not getting the direct stimulus of seeing like the light going above the left lever press or the right lever press. But it still was able to interpret the brain's activity enough so that it did better than chance. So that's what those data show. It's still obviously it's a direct manipulation of neural activity from one brain to another brain through wires and requiring processing of the information to be then transposed to the decoder rat. Oops.
So what we have then is something comparable to the prosthetic that I was talking about before.
Except that you have the internet involved. That's essentially what that is.
So it's still not telepathy, and it's still not
definitely not
thoughts.
No.
So I mean, there's like no aspect of telepathy being carried out here.
In some ways it's thoughts, but it's not thoughts that's being transposed from one brain to the other without wires. It requires an electrode being placed into both animals. It requires them to be connected and being processed through a computer. It's not thoughts being transposed from one brain to the other directly, other than the fact that it's going through wires. So it's just silly. And the brains are utterly mechanical. That's why this can work, right? Neural activity in one brain area, allowing that's going to be reminiscent of what driving the animal's ability to do like the lever press. We can decode that information and then just put it into the brain of the other animal, as long as we're putting it into the right brain area, to get that other animal to sense that information and then to make also the correct choice. That's basically
it was many years ago. I saw some research about it was alluding to, and this was not in a peer-reviewed article. This was a science magazine, and how I've learned how untrustworthy it is to read a science magazine, basically popular press, where now you're reading a reporter's interpretation of a scientific paper. So it's there's another filter that it had to go through, another filter of interpretation that it had to go to. But one of the things it was talking about was that scientists had recorded images from a dream,
Mm.
and it was virtually unintelligible, as I remember. I can't remember what the image was, but are you aware of the research I'm referring to?
I remember hearing about that. There's, basically, okay, let's back up a little bit. There is some visual information that you can record from dreams of animals. We do know that we can do some of that. When a rat is navigating through a maze, there will be activity that we will see in some brain areas that will be specific to certain portions of it, of that maze. Okay, so as it's going in the beginning of the maze, you're going to see some activity in some hippocampal neurons, for instance, that'll fire with an increased frequency while they're in that area. And then when they move to the next area, there'll be a different set of neurons that'll fire. And then as they move to the next area, there'll be a different set of neurons that'll fire. Then basically you can get this map that gets made of the hippocampus, okay, by using that process. And so that's one thing that the rat or the mouse is using to navigate its space. We know that this kind of thing also occurs in humans too, that the hippocampus can do similar things in humans. We do know that when rats are asleep, they will have a replay of those neurons firing in that sequence as if that they are traveling through the maze. So in some ways, we do know a little bit about like what they're actually dreaming about because of that. Is that the actual picture? I mean, we can decode the information and say, oh, well, we know that when this neuron was firing when the mouse was at this part in the maze, and now it's firing again, it must be dreaming about being in this part of the maze. Because it then does it in the exact same pattern as it navigates around the maze. We see the same exact thing. It's a replay of that place map. There are neurons in the visual cortex that will also fire as the mouse is navigating a maze. It tends to not be quite as place-centric as it is in the visual cortex. And when the mouse is asleep, we see the same kind of pattern that occurs, even in the visual cortex. So, which would be coincident with the change, with the increase, with that pattern of activity that we'd see in the hippocampus. So when we're dreaming, we're seeing visual stimuli. We're imagining that we're seeing visual stimuli. We're imagining that we're hearing things. It's not surprising that perception involves the same brain areas that we use to do those same things. And we could decode that information. Now, it hasn't been done in humans. I don't know. We've done.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you say that we don't use the same areas of the brain for the dreaming, because one of the things I noticed in my dreams is that strange thing. In a lot of my dreams, I mean, I can fly. In a lot of my dreams, I have like superpowers or whatever. I just, not every dream, but I've had a lot where I have abilities like that. But one thing I have noticed that I can't do, curiously, is read.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So like if you have a book in front of you, you can't read it at all? Or
there might be some important information on this book or on this sign or whatever it is. But when I look at it, I can't see the words. They're not intelligible as words. Yeah. It's like Chinese scripts, that I don't know. So, yeah.
That's interesting. I don't know enough about dreaming. That's not where my expertise comes in. So I have to defer to, I wish I could tell you more. So your audience knows a little bit about like what I work on. My research actually focuses on like brain development. And so I know an awful lot about how brains get wired up. I know an awful lot about like the mechanisms of like how neurons get born and how they migrate to certain areas of the brain. And I do this in the context of neuroendocrinology. I am willing to, as much as I can BS on neuroscience topics for sure, I'm willing to admit my limitations, and dreaming is definitely one of them because that's getting pretty far from where I'm at. So I wouldn't even begin to be able to speculate like why
the reason I brought it up.
Dreams.
The reason I brought it up, the reason I thought it relevant is because the images that we see, because there's telepathy has been transmitted a bunch of different ways. I mean, some of the most commonly in our movies or whatever, is when you hear that voice echoing in your head. Use the force, something like that, right? But it isn't always that. I mean, sometimes it's a
Mhm.
mental image, and there's a handful of self-professed psychics that used to work for the police department or whatever that would see images and take their direction from that.
Right.
While misdirecting the investigation of a missing child or whatever.
Sure.
But,
Yeah. Now, one thing about getting back to this paper and the reason why it was sent to you, this is supposedly proof that Christianity is absolutely true. Now, I don't get the connection there, first of all, to Christianity, because I don't think Christianity requires the ability to perform telepathy. But the other thing is that this paper, frankly, removes it from the paranormal. Like, if this was really a mechanism that was actually viable, and it's not, it's got big problems in this paper. It's got all kinds of flaws and clearly misinterpretation of evidence that's been published in much superior papers by other scientists. But even if it was true, this is an utterly physical mechanism. This has absolutely nothing to do with spiritual woo or anything like that. It would still be an utterly physical mechanism if you could detect the coordinated activity, electrical magnetic pulses that are dependent upon the activity of neurons in the brain. It would still be physical. Now, it just can't work the way that this author is trying to explain. And the author goes through a number of other things, other potential mechanisms, and he has this section on mirror neurons, and I wanted to touch on that a little bit. Do you know what mirror neurons are?
oh yes, I remember Ramachandran
Yeah.
gave a great
Mhm.
talk on that, and I tried to arrange an interview with him, but I guess I wasn't well known enough. I don't think
Sure.
I still don't think I'm well known enough to get the man's attention.
He's a hot shot, so he's
Yeah.
kind of our Elvis Presley of the neuroscience world. I mean, I don't know, that might be overstating a little bit, but he's very, very well known in the neuroscience world. And he's a very magnetic speaker, so to speak.
Pun
He
intended.
Yes, exactly, indeed. So he's done a fair amount of work on like phantom limb syndrome, and he works with human patients on various interesting things to learn about how the brain works. So phantom limb syndrome is this really interesting phenomenon that for some patients, when you cut off the limb, they will still feel as if that limb is still there. And that's because when you cut off the limb, sure, you're cutting off the limb, but as I mentioned, those nerves are still in the arm. And of course, those nerves go to the spinal cord and then they go up into the brain. And so you still have a representation of your limb in your brain. Just because you cut off the arm doesn't mean that representation goes away. So then some of these patients will suffer from, extreme pain. They'll feel like the limb is cramping in some way, or that like it's contorted in some strange way. And that's
a degradation in the nerve endings, is it?
Yeah, that's partly it, but it's also because you're just not, well, one, we don't know. There's a lot of hypothesizing about what underlies phantom limb syndrome. That is a potential hypothesis. The other could be an altered feedback mechanism, that the motor output isn't able to talk to the sensory input, and therefore that's diminished, and so that lack of sensory input is now causing distress in the somatosensory cortex, which is used for detecting pain. So it's based up in the cortex. So there's a lot of hypothesizing about it. But he's done a fair amount of work on that with human patients, and it's super interesting stuff. But where were we going with that? With Ramachandran, and I'd mentioned, mirror neurons. Yes. So mirror neurons, getting back to that. So mirror neurons are these really interesting neurons that have been originally discovered in primates. So in macaque monkeys, there was a scientist who was recording the grasping behavior in a macaque. So they were recording in some place of the premotor cortex, I believe it was, and they were looking for grasp. So they were looking at the activity of these neurons, and every time the monkey grasped like a nut or something like that, there would be activity. So they were going through these tasks, and then when the experimenter was done, he went to grab the nut away, and because like, okay, I got to put my monkey back and we'll just pick it up again tomorrow. But when he grabbed the nut himself, he realized that he saw that there was increased activity in the same neuron that was supposedly a motor neuron. And so then he figured out that this neuron not only responds to the monkey reaching out and grasping, but also seeing another individual reaching out and grasping as well. So it was mirroring. So basically the activity was true in whether the monkey was doing it itself or seeing another individual doing that same behavior. So essentially a mirror of those two things. Now, this created a lot of buzz when this first came out, because then it was thought that, okay, well, we know that humans, of course, have empathy and that we can perceive the pain and suffering of other people. And sometimes you can even feel it for yourself. So maybe there are other kinds of neurons that are doing the same thing, that they're mirroring the activity in our own brains. There was a vast search done to try to find additional mirror neurons outside of the somatosensory cortex. And we came up short. There was no evidence for mirror neurons outside of this sort of select group of neurons.
So the mirror neurons that we know of are related to or an extension of motor neurons.
Yes, it seems to be related to adaptability of in training motor patterns. So which makes sense. Like if you are learning to grasp and reach out to things, you're looking at your own hand. You're also looking at the hands of the people that are training you, and that eventually that activity is going to be correlated and directly driving motor activity, right?
So my wife liked to tell me that when she was a little girl, she would watch her dad sitting in the lazy boy chair watching kung fu movies, and she would watch during the battle scenes as little flinches as he would.
Yeah. Right. I've done that too. I remember when I was like when my son was very young, and I was feeding him his food, and I try to get him like the spoon, trying to get it right in, and I'd be like, okay, open your mouth, and I'd be doing the same thing unconsciously, thinking like, okay, that's going, and I think that's part of how we learn, and that there is a reflection that occurs, but it has nothing to do. So mirror neurons have been thought to be related to like autism, that maybe autistic patients have a lack of mirror neurons or not enough mirror neurons, or their mirror neurons are messed up. We know that we just see no evidence that mirror neurons are any way related to emotion or perception of feelings.
There's clearly a perception of feelings. We don't
absolutely, but it's not mirror neurons. We don't see.
I mean, if I see a child,
it would be like if you are perceiving pain. Like, so if I were to be feeling pain myself, there would be activity in my brain. If I perceive the pain of another person, it's not the same areas that get lit up. We don't see any evidence of that kind of coordinated activity like we do for the actual mirror neurons, which is simply just around specific motor behavior.
I remember seeing a child with an ice cream cone, just a tiny child, and it was so happy with this ice cream cone, except that they didn't have much motor control, and the ice cream glob scoop fell out of the cone and into the dirt of the playground. And I could see the look of the child's face, my ice cream, and I felt such pity.
The wounding, yes, of the pain that this poor little kid is feeling. But it wouldn't be a mirror neuron that was involved. The only mirror neuron that could have been involved was his lack of coordination in holding on to that ice cream scoop. It was not your pain. That's not, a mirror neuron has a sort of very specific definition. And so this author is trying to claim that somehow mirror neurons are one way of transposing this information because you have this coordinated activity across the brain. Again, how would this specific subset of neurons that is specifically around grasping and like other motor related behaviors be coordinated across from one brain to the other brain via this mechanism? It makes no sense whatsoever. That could not possibly be the mechanism by which mirror neurons work, not EMF that's being detected in the brain.
And even though it is significant, still, I mean, there's some degree of significance of doing the hardwired Ethernet test.
Oh yeah,
between brains.
Yes,
that's not really as profound as prosthetics. I don't think.
I would. Well, okay. I think that the hardwired rat test with the encoder and the decoder, it's interesting in a lot of ways because it actually specifically around prosthetics, because say if you have someone who's quadriplegic, they're or that there's some sort of neuropathy where we can't get good signals at, say, the limbs or the stump or whatever. It might be possible then to if we can get better understanding that neural activity can be read out to coordinated activity in another part of the body. So if we needed to connect, say, activity from the one part of the brain down to, say, the spinal cord to bypass some injury here, well, understanding how one part of the brain talks to the other part of the brain in this way allows for, well, I don't know, like allowing us to sort of better read out those kinds of things. I could see this research being used in some interesting ways. But I agree, it's not very profound. I mean, it's
but
like
they're not
transmitting.
They're not able to transmit either the spoken or the image thought. Just
this is
all
just
of
a readout of something that we know is associated with the animal doing a certain kind of task, and then that gets transposed to a similar brain area in a different animal, and then that animal is using that information to say, oh, I should be reaching to this area in order to get a reward, and then they do it. That's basically it.
And some astute listener might realize, well, yeah, 100 years ago, telephones required wires, and now they don't. Okay,
yes,
maybe there's still a possibility there, but I don't see it now. No. There's no medium. There's no the magnetic field is not strong enough. There's no receptors. There's no means of transmitting such a signal.
A cell phone works by, of course, long distance, but it's because it's using radio frequencies that we know can go long distances without significant degradation. Of course, there's a limit to it. All of us have been without cell phone service in rural areas because you're not close enough to a tower. So it has to be close enough. The EMF does not, first of all, it's not radio frequencies. So it's just a magnetic. What this author's arguing is that it's just changes in magnetic frequency that animals are able to detect. And it's just not strong enough, nor is it going to be the kind of thing that could be detected any distance away from the head more than like a meter for sure.
Well, you're just using AM. Wait till you move up to FM, and then you'll
pick it better. Yeah, that's right. We need frequency modulation, not amplitude modulation.
Dr. Thompson, thank you so much for being on with this and for helping me out with this, because I mean, I tried to read this and there's just, I wasn't going to be able to make sense of this. So I sincerely appreciate you being able to make sense of it for me.
I'm happy I could do that. Next time you got some other boneheaded thing about neuroscience, I'm your guy. I'm happy to come in and debunk whatever.
Outstanding. All right, so the links to look up Chris Thompson, his YouTube channel is into the description. And Chris, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much.